Okay, so let me start with this slide. This is actually from one of the things that I'm not having you read for today, but it's chapter 1, section 10. Um, this kind of gives me an opportunity to clarify and correct something I said in an earlier video. I told you earlier that red pandas are equally related to skunks as they are to raccoons, right? And so one of the things you should be doing at some point is to look at a tree like this and say, well, no, I mean, what we're looking at here is a pattern of common ancestry. The more recent the further to the right you go on the left-hand side of the tree, the more recent the common ancestors. So according to this, raccoons are most closely related to weasels and otters. Weasels and otters are most closely related to each other, but raccoons are more closely related to weasels and otters than they are to red pandas. And red pandas are more closely related to both raccoons and weasels and otters because they share this common ancestor than they are to skunks, right? So skunks are actually more distantly related than raccoons. That's the thing that was incorrect, right? But the thing that we said that was correct was that if you compare the relationship between red pandas and raccoons, it's closer than the relationship between red pandas and giant pandas because giant pandas are actually bears, right? And so you would have to go further back. You have to go further to a more ancient common ancestor to get the common ancestor shared by red pandas and giant pandas, right? And so there's that little correction. Okay? The one point that I gave you was correct, that red pandas are indeed more closely related to raccoons. But one thing I did say was that was not correct was that red pandas are equally related to skunks as they are to raccoons. And at least according to this um, cladogram, this tree of life, evolutionary family tree, this tells us that raccoons and red pandas are more closely related to each other than anybody is to a skunk. Again, because you have to go back to a more ancient common ancestor to get to the skunk relative. All right, correction done. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today, okay, is the meaning of evolution, right? Evolution in a strictly biological sense could actually have at least two significant meanings, right? One meaning basically tell you, evolution means kind of like a change. And so if we think about the change of all of life, the entire biosphere over its 3.6, maybe 3.7 or 8 billion year history on the Earth, that is biological evolution, right? That kind of makes sense. You're probably used to thinking about it on those terms. If you go back to the earliest forms of life documented by the fossil record little smudges of organic material in the shape of cells on rocks from the oldest parts of, from the oldest rocks we have on the Earth. Some of them are in Greenland, some of them are in South Africa, some of them are in the western side of Australia. Um, we have a pretty convincing indication that cellular life was there not long after the Earth formed. The Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And so, when you want to talk about planetary evolution, one little factoid that you want to know is that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and life has been here for 3.6 out of those 4.5 billion years, right? And so, yeah, life has been around for pretty much the entire history of life on Earth. And over that time, things have changed dramatically. We started off with only things like archaea and bacteria. Remember the prokaryotes, right? The two prokaryotic domains, archaea and bacteria, were around from about 3.6 billion years ago. And they were the only forms of life for, roughly, 2 billion years, right? And then around 1.5 billion years ago, that's around the time we see the origin of the eukarya, that third domain of life that includes us, right? And in the early days of the eukaryotes, we didn't have animals and plants and fungi and protists. We only had organisms that we would call protists. And then animals and plants and fungi took their origin sometime, between a billion years ago and 500 million years ago, right? And so there's a whole history to life on Earth. We covered that narrative in in greater depth in BIO202, and basically, yeah, take BIO202 if you want the full lowdown on the complete narrative of life on Earth. A little shameless plug for my other class, right? So yeah, I mean, you could talk about evolution as all the changes that have occurred to the life, as to all of life over the course of its long history on Earth, right? And then evolution also refers to the process, or should I say processes, by which this change occurs, right? And so, what are the causes of organisms to change, life change? And those are the evolutionary processes. And that study, not only what happened, but also how it happened. Those are what I consider to be the two major thrusts of the study of evolution. Okay? Um, Now, evolution by natural selection is only part of that, and basically Darwin comes in and gives us evolution by natural selection. I've got a whole another lecture in the near future that's going to cover that particular topic, and I just wanted to make it clear that well, I mean, I'm using evolution here as a jumping off point for something that we discussed in the previous lecture. Okay. Now, when we talk about biological evolution, realize that there are other kinds of ways that the word evolution can be used. A really common thing that scientists speak about is stellar evolution, how stars are born. But you could also do the same thing for planetary evolution, which might actually be more relevant to a biology class, because we'll be talking about how the Earth's atmosphere has changed, right? In the earliest days of the Earth, we had no oxygen, no atmospheric oxygen. And then all of a sudden, well, maybe not all of a sudden, but then in one major, we call it the Great Oxygen Revolution, happening around 2.5 billion years ago or so, between 2.5 and 1.9 billion years, oxygen is appearing as a permanent, entity, as a permanent gas presence in the atmosphere. And so that's an aspect of planetary evolution that is going to bear some significance to our class, because we'll be talking later about the processes of photosynthesis and the mechanisms and causes by which the very first eukaryotic cells evolved. Right? And so, yeah, the planetary evolution is a part of biological evolution, partly because you could say, well, the reason why O2 appears in the first place is because of the evolution of photosynthesis. Biology drove planetary evolution, at least in that sense. Planetary evolution is usually in the driver's seat. For example, in the earliest days of the Earth, the Earth was simply too hot to allow for the existence of liquid water, right? Around 4.6 billion years ago is when the sun formed from, well, whatever was there before it. I'll be happy to talk with you about that if you like, or you can get that information from your astronomy teacher. But the Earth basically congealed from rocks that were there orbiting around this giant star that formed. And yeah, when the rocks coalesced, it was too hot. And then relatively soon after that, within the first 500 million years, we had the formation of the oceans. And only after we had the formation of the oceans could life actually evolve. And so that would be a situation where planetary evolution is permitting biological evolution to initiate, right? And so you've got changes in, for example, the Earth's crust. Continents move, oceans move, continents occupy locations that cause the Earth to get colder. Continents occupy locations that prevent the oceans from circulating. The oceans go anoxic. I mean, these are things that happen. Basically, there's an interplay between things that are going on simply as a result of changes in the Earth and changes in life. Again, these are all topics that we cover in greater depth in BIO110. It's really fascinating stuff, right? Okay. But when we think about, well, what are we really responsible for thinking about for BIO110 in this first part of the semester, we want you to know about the process of evolution by natural selection. That's Darwin's model, right? The idea that if you have a bunch of organisms and some are taller and some are shorter, and the world favors the shorter ones, that's going to result in the shorter ones being more likely to reproduce. And if the shorter ones are the ones that reproduce, then the offspring of the parents are going to be shorter in the next generation. So the population evolves from generation to generation. That's it in a nutshell. Okay, so it's you can call this Darwin's model or hypothesis for how early giraffes start off with relatively short necks. This is an early giraffe, and later on we've got giraffes with longer necks. Right? And so forth. I mean, how do we see this change from longer to longer necks in the fossil record of giraffes? Well, I mean, what we're saying here is that the giraffes with the longer necks were the ones that had greater success in surviving and getting nutrients, and they passed on their longer neck characteristics to their offspring, and they were also selected for longer necks, and they passed on the longer necked successful parents passed on longer necks to their offspring, and so forth and so on until we end up with this ridiculously long neck thing. Right? This is a horrible giraffe, but you get the idea. And that's kind of like a very extreme version of the story, right? So Darwin offered us the model. This is how we explain phenomenon that needs explaining, right? The sequential growth in the neck length of giraffes over the course of their fossil history all the way to the present is something that is demonstrably requiring explanation. And Darwin's model says that we've got this pattern of natural selection continually favoring longer and longer necks, right? Now, can this be supported? Is this subject to testable? Is it testable? Oh yeah, actually it's testable. I mean, there's some aspects of this type of evolution that would make it difficult for us to actually carry out an experiment, but you can actually do experimental biology on shorter lived organisms. And in fact, you've got a lot of experimentation on things like bacteria, not only in lab experimentation, but also natural experimentation, because you know that bacteria start off as being very susceptible to antibiotics. And then as we start using antibiotics, that creates selection for greater resistance. And after 10 or 15 years, we end up with a whole bunch of bacteria that have evolved to become very antibiotic resistant, right? Resistant. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, the model is testable. It has support. This is why Darwin's model of evolution by natural selection is a standard fixture in biology classes everywhere in the world where you're teaching legitimate biology. Okay. So here's the question. Is evolution by natural selection a fact? No, no, okay? We went through this in the previous lecture. Is it a fact that organisms evolve by natural selection? Well, I mean, we're not saying it's not true, but I would like, as a scientist, for you to consider everything we talk about to be a model, and maybe models have so much support that we treat them as though they were facts, as though they were definitive truths. But the reality is that this is a statement that's being made about the natural universe that's based on evidence from the natural universe itself. In other words, it falls within the domain of science, and it still requires evidentiary support, and it's not something that we're going to be accepting as a fact without that support, right? If not for this vast amount of support, we would not consider evolution a fact. right? We don't really consider it a fact now, but we do consider it highly supported and therefore very, very likely to be the truth. Right? Can evolution be falsified? Can evolution by natural selection be falsified? Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. You can actually demonstrate that for many situations, natural selection may not be the best explanation for how it came to be, right? Um, if you have a population of uh, of taller organisms evolve into shorter organisms, you know, that might happen as a result of random chance. And if it happens as a result of random chance, then you're not justified in saying that it was driven by natural selection. And so, sometimes we have evolutionary phenomena that are not related to natural selection. And in those situations, yeah, natural selection is certainly falsified. Is it falsifiable as a general premise, though? I mean, can you, with one single result, cast into doubt the millions of results that have supported it? Probably not. Okay? It would take a lot more than just one result. Now, the last parts of our discussion are going to be this. Okay, where were we? I had to pause to go talk to somebody who was knocking on my door. Okay, so I think we're just right here. Okay, can science be flawed? Yes. Right. I mean, science is a process. Okay, one, we're offering support based on evidence, and sometimes the evidence can lead us in the wrong direction. Right. And so as a process, we're never really proving anything without any doubt. There's no proof, even when science is done in the best of all possible ways. And the other side of this is that scientists can be flawed, very much so. I'm flawed. You're probably flawed, and so recognize the fact that scientists can make mistakes, and sometimes they're innocent mistakes, and sometimes they're much less innocent. I think that we have to expect that sometimes science requires us to revisit what we've learned in the past, and yeah, I can't say that we're definitely going to be uh, giving you all the right information every time, but when we give you information, there's going to be some amount of evidentiary support from the natural universe. Okay? And by the way, in the textbook, you've got this other thing. So I want to point this out. It's in chapter 1, section 7. There's this little diagram. And I think this is kind of an interesting add to the textbook because when we usually talk about science, we usually think about there being just this part, right? You can call this the pure science, where you could interact with just the natural universe and have that be it. Okay, people at least from the pure scientific standpoint, people really shouldn't figure into the picture. I mean, if the issue is simply getting to know nature by interrogating nature, then we really don't need to have other people involved. Okay, but the fact that people are doing this process requires us to have a little bit of oversight. We need to collaborate with people and with other people and get some input from them. This is actually a real part for practical science. Okay, we're bringing in the practice of science requires some review, feedback. We don't, consider as entirely valid things that people come up with unless they've been subject to peer review, et cetera. So there's an opportunity to police what gets identified as scientific advances. Okay, so this is like the reality of science. Okay. And maybe back in the day of Aristotle, it would have been enough simply just to have the interaction between the interrogation of nature and nature itself. Okay. In the time since, we've realized that we need to have teams of people working on this to get the best possible result, right? People come in on the other end of it because we're thinking about, well, why do people become scientists? And a lot of people will tell you that they become scientists so they can make the world a better place, to make things better for humankind. Okay? Whereas, I mean, the bottom line truth is that people don't have to be in that at all. There can be science that has absolutely no value to humankind whatsoever, and it would still be every bit as valid as something that leads to the cure for cancer, right? The cure for cancer is of interest to people, and that might give it greater weight than something that doesn't have as much practicality. But if we're answering a really important question of the natural universe, I consider that to be the most pure form of science of all, right? And that's an attitude that is carried by a lot of scientists, and I just wanted you to be aware of that, right? For people in BIO110, the target population for BIO110 are mostly people that are going into some type of allied health field, in which case clinical applications of science seem to carry a lot of weight. So I would like you to be aware that there's kind of like an interaction that is not always going to be considered as terribly as central as you might think is as you might expect. You might be expecting science classes to be all about societal benefits. Whereas a class like BIO110 is a pure science class, and so we tend to be focusing on the interrogation of nature to understand nature itself. And yeah, it does have some relationship to becoming a good practicing clinician, but that's not the main focus of our class. Okay, that's it for this week. I will see you next time.